Hi everyone, thanks for joining in. I'm excited to have Carolyn Bishop joining me today. Hi Carolyn.
Hi Jackie, thank you for having me. Nice to be here.
Carolyn's a British Canadian freelance writer and author. After working as a journalist in London for 10 years, in 2013 she moved to Switzerland, where she has happily indulged in the country's cheese, chocolate, and gorgeous scenery ever since. Her adopted home inspired her debut novel, The Other Daughter, which is a time slip story about family secrets set between Switzerland and London in 1976 and 2016. And her second novel is The Lost Chapter, which is a tale of female friendship set partly at a finishing school in Lyon, France in 1957. And that was published earlier this year. So thanks again, Carolyn, for joining us. Just wondering if you want to start off by telling us a bit about The Lost Chapter.
So this is the Lost Chapter here, and yes, as Jackie said, it's another dual timeline story, set partly in present day England in a small town, and partly in 1957 in a finishing school in Lyon, France. And it's about my main character, Flo, or Florence, who, when we meet her in the present day, is 80 years old. She lives in this small town in England. She's had a very long and eventful life. She's quite happy in her old age. She's an artist and she spends her time making intricate lino prints in her garden studio. So she's quite content until one day she reads a review in a newspaper of a new novel, and she realizes that this novel is written by Lily, an old school friend of hers. The two of them went to finishing school together in the 1950s. And this is really quite a big deal for Flo because it brings back some old demons that she thought she'd buried a long time ago. So she goes to buy this novel and she reads it. And as she does, she realizes that she has to somehow make peace with what happened in her past. And so eventually she decides to go to France to track down Lily, her old friend, and put the past to rest. And she does this when she takes this road trip. She takes with her Alice, who is an 18-year-old girl who has been walking Flo's dog over the summer holidays. And Alice has a few demons of her own. So Alice and also her mother, Carla, go with Flo on this trip. Both of them have their own problems, and Flo hopes that this trip will help them come to terms with the issues in their own lives as well, and to repair their relationship.
And could you tell us what was the first idea you had for this book?
I think for me, my stories always come from the characters first. So I knew I wanted to write about an older woman, actually. I feel like older women are often overlooked in stories and in films and in the media in general. So I wanted to write about this like really amazing 8-year-old woman who's had this very full life and has a lot going for her. And this is the real sort of driving force behind the story. So I think that came first. And then I live in Switzerland, and there used to be lots of finishing schools here, and I was really interested in that idea, the concept of, you know, these young, usually quite well-to-do women who essentially are groomed for marriage and children and homemaking and not much else. And I found this concept really strange, and so I wanted to sort of set it in this arena. And France had finishing schools as well, so I know Lyon very well because I was a student there once a long time ago, and so I thought this would be an opportunity to set it in Lyon and to write about finishing schools.
And what about the research? Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, well, because there are finishing schools here, in fact, there are a few. There aren't really any schools that would still be considered finishing schools now, but they still exist in a different form. So there's an international school here that used to be a finishing school. So I went along and talked to the headmistress, and they also had a really interesting book all about their history, because I think they were 150 years old or something. So I read that and was talking to the headmistress, and she had some really interesting stories to share. So that was sort of my starting point. And then I looked in newspaper archives, and there were quite a few interesting stories about finishing schools in other places. So in London, there used to be finishing schools too. So yeah, some of the sort of stories I read, and just the attitudes towards women in that era were really fascinating. So yeah, that was my main sort of starting point.
Yeah. Have you got an interesting story you might be able to share with us that didn't make it into your book?
Ooh. Um, I think what I liked about the finishing school here is that although often you sort of think, and in my book actually, the characters come from England and America, the main characters, but actually young women will come from all over the world to finishing schools in Switzerland in particular. And so I think just the sort of cultural differences, it was quite interesting to read about. And, there were young students from India who didn't like to walk anywhere. They wanted to take taxis because they were worried about what wildlife there would be in Switzerland or something. And I just found, I think that's really interesting. And even though I think finishing schools, the whole concept to me is not great, I think actually that aspect of it during my research, I found really interesting that it brought students together from all over the world, as would happen now in any university. But that was one really good thing about it, I think, is that they had a sort of a cultural awareness that perhaps students that had stayed in their home countries wouldn't have had.
Yeah, yeah. And we've got a few people watching, so just reminding the people watching, if you have any questions for Carolyn, please type them in comments and I can read them out. Kelly has a question. She said your book has a great title, it's very catchy, and she wonders if you chose it and also the cover as well.
That's really nice to know because we had quite a lot of stresses about the title. Yes, I suppose in the end I did choose it, but I had sort of lots of other ideas first. I really wasn't quite sure what to call this one. My first book, The Other Daughter, I had that title from the beginning and it stayed throughout, whereas for some reason this one felt harder, but I do like what we came up with. And the cover, yes, I'm really happy with the cover. I like the colours and I like the fact that Lyon is in the background here, which, because it's a city I know quite well, that was really nice for me to have that in the background.
And could you tell us, have you always wanted to be an author?
I think I've always wanted to write in some way.
Yeah.
I think when I was younger, growing up, being a novelist just seemed like this completely far-fetched thing that I would never achieve. So I don't think that I ever had that as my aim. But I always loved writing. As a kid, I would write stories. And then when it came to choosing a career, I wanted to go into journalism, more feature writing rather than news, because I love crafting a story, and feature writing that essentially is that. So I think that was my first step to be in journalism. And then after that, I just started writing in my spare time before work. And I wrote my first novel, which was never published. I wrote about probably getting on 15 years ago now. I wrote it before going to my job. I get up about 6 a.m. and write for an hour or so before work every day. And the end result was rubbish. It was never published, but I'm really glad that I did that because it showed me that I could actually get to the end of a manuscript and produce something. So even though it was never published, it was a good learning experience. And then when I moved to Switzerland, I turned freelance. So that gave me more time, or at least I was still busy, but I could organise my time how I wanted. So I didn't have an office to go to 9 to 5. So then it became a bit easier to find the time to write another one. So that's when I started writing The Other Daughter, and that became my first published novel.
And could you tell us how, like a bit about your publishing journey and how hard or easy that was for you?
I would guess it's probably fairly typical. So that first novel I wrote that was never published, that was my sort of trial run, I suppose, and I pitched that to lots of agents and didn't get anywhere. Had a few nice comments, quite a few never replied, which is pretty standard. And after a while, a few years, I think, I gave up on that book. So that was my sort of first introduction to it. And then when I wrote The Other Daughter, I think I started writing that in 2016, and it took me a good couple of years to get it into the shape I thought it needed to be in. I think when I'd first written that starter novel, I didn't really know what I was doing, and I didn't really I didn't really sort of look for any advice. I didn't read any books about writing craft or anything like that, which seems a bit strange to me now. But when I went to write the second one in 2016, I changed tack. I thought, right, I'm going to try and do this properly. So I read quite a lot about story structure. I did a couple of short courses, and that really helped me get to the end of that draft and then know better how to hone it and how to improve it. And so then but it still probably took about 9-10 months from when I first started pitching agents to when I eventually got my agent, which was in, I think, November 18. And then after that we had an editing process. My editor, I think, is brilliant. My agent is brilliant at editing. So I did about 6 months or so editing with her before it went on submission. And then I was lucky enough to get a deal.
And is there anything that you've learnt throughout that process and everything that you wish you'd known at the start?
I wish I got started on reading about the craft of writing a bit earlier, I suppose. I think also just one thing I would tell myself now is just to keep going. It's so tempting to give up. It's so easy to give up. And you get, typically you get stuck in this sort of sticky middle. You're 40,000 words and you don't know where to go next. And I think I would just tell myself that that's normal and that everybody goes through that, and just to keep going. And once you've got that first draft, even if it's very messy and you don't think you like it at all, at least you've got something to work with. And then for me, the real work comes after you've got that draft. It's about the editing, and that's where the story really takes shape and you can hopefully make it into the novel that you really want.
Yeah. And what about what you like reading yourself? Is there anything you might have been reading lately that you want to recommend to us?
I think I read quite widely, and I think actually since I've been published, that's expanded even more. I mean, I have some favourite authors that I've loved for a long time, like Maggie O'Farrell and Kate Atkinson, but I think since I've been published, I've expanded what I read, because it's really interesting, obviously just for the pleasure of reading, but also for my own craft, to sort of see how different authors approach books and to see different ways of writing. So that's been really interesting. A couple of books that I've read lately, one called All My Mothers by Joanna Glenn, she's got on my shelf there, which I just thought was beautiful. It's a story about a young girl who suspects that her mother is not her biological mother, and she goes on a journey to track down her real mother, and that takes her to Cordoba in Spain, and it's just so wonderfully written and well described, and absolutely loved it. And I've just finished actually a book that's not quite out yet. I was lucky enough to get an early proof of That Bone Set a Woman by Frances Quinn. Comes out in July. Frances wrote The Smallest Man, that was her debut last year, so it's a historical novel, and I absolutely loved it. It's so witty and charming and just full of brilliant female characters. So I would thoroughly recommend that when it comes out in July.
Thanks for those recommendations. I'm wondering if you're working on something new at the moment.
I am. I can't probably reveal too much about it at the moment, but it is another dual timeline novel set in a period of recent history that I find really fascinating, but I'm still at a fairly early stage. So, yeah.
And have you always been interested in history?
Yes, although I wouldn't have naturally said that was my thing, and I didn't really set out to write historical novels, but I have always been interested in history, but I think I often find it quite dry. I find just reading a history textbook or something not particularly stimulating, even though I find the history itself interesting, if you know what I mean. So I actually feel like most of the history that I've learned has come from historical novels. I went through a phase of reading a lot of Philippa Gregory's books, which I think are brilliant. And I feel like I learned a lot about the sort of Tudor kings and queens from her books. So that's sort of where my interest came from. And then when I started writing novels, so The Other Daughter is set partly in 1970s Switzerland, and it's about the history of women's rights in Switzerland. because Switzerland was very late to give women the vote, and also a lot of other rights came a lot later. And having moved here, I discovered this and found it really interesting. So it wasn't that I set out to be a historical novelist, it's just that this particular period of history interested me, and I thought, right, I really want to write about this. And so when it came to the lost chapter, I suppose it was similar, again, living in Switzerland, having these finishing schools around, and I thought, well, I find that really interesting. So yes, it's been nice for me to have that research process and to be able to learn more about history, but with the purpose of having it in my book, which is, it's been really interesting.
And do you have a favourite time period?
I mean, not specifically, but I do find 20th century history, late 20th, I suppose, second half of the 20th century, really interesting, but I guess because it feels quite recent, and so it feels quite identifiable, and particularly women's issues, things about women getting the vote and the attitudes of finishing schools. I find that interesting because it feels like we've come a long way, and yet at the same time I sort of feel in other aspects we haven't, and I quite like to draw that out in my books to make that parallel between 30, 40 years ago and what's happening now. And although we've moved on hugely, I sort of feel like there's still work to be done.
And Kelly wonders what's the most challenging part of writing in two different time periods.
I think making both of them as interesting as each other, giving them equal weight. I think often with dual timelines, and I suppose this is hard to say because every reader approaches the book differently and has different interests, but you want as much as possible to make the reader interested equally in both timelines. I think for me, I want the timelines to be very strongly interwoven. I don't want them to be separate stories. I want one to inform the other, and I want, when the reader is reading it, I want them to really feel like they have to know what's happened in the other timeline in order for the other one to make sense, if you know what I mean. So it's quite a sort of tangled web, but I think that makes them interesting.
And what do you think makes a good story?
That's a big question. I think for me the most important thing is the characters. Having characters that are well-rounded and interesting, identifiable. I don't think they have to be likable, but I think you have to, as a reader, you have to understand where they're coming from or be able to empathize in some way. So I always try to do that, but it is quite fun to have characters with not so nice character traits. But yeah, I think you'll go anywhere with a character in a plot if you root for that character and you identify with them. I prefer stories that are character driven rather than solely about plot, although plot is very important too.
And while you're writing, do you have someone that you share your work with, or do you just wait till the end and give it to your editor?
I like to get my first draft as good as I can make it before I show it to anyone. I'm very wary of giving it to someone too early, I suppose. I think it's more about I want to get the story straight in my own head first, and then when you get criticism or whatever feedback, you're sort of better able to know what to do with it because you know in your own head what you want the story to be. So I think I tried to do that, but I do have two very good friends who I think have similar reading tastes to me, and they are the two I would give it to first, because I feel like if they didn't like it, then there's something gone terribly wrong here. And then after that, obviously my agent is one of the first people to read it, and after that I might give it to people a bit more widely because it's good to get different viewpoints on it. But yeah, my first two readers, my good friends, I think if they don't like it, then I've not got this right.
And what have you found to be your favourite part of your publishing journey so far?
I mean, it's been a funny publishing journey for me because my first book came out in the middle of the pandemic. Second one was earlier this year, so it's the tail end of Omicron. So it's I haven't, and I live in Switzerland, so I haven't been able to get back to the UK where my book came out first to see it on shelves and things. So that's been a bit strange, I suppose. But I think just knowing that it's out there and that people are reading it, getting messages from readers is such a nice thing because you write the book. I try to write the books that I like to read, but to know that other people have read them and have enjoyed them and have got something from it, that's really important. So I would always say, if you're a reader and you love a book, do tell the author, do tweet them or send them a message or something, because it really means a huge amount.
And do you have a favourite place to write?
Not really. I'm quite flexible. I think because I was a journalist before this and a freelancer, I've always written at home and I've always had deadlines. So I think I'm quite good at just juggling that and fitting in the novel writing when I can. So I suppose ideally I'd write in the morning, because I think that's when I write best, probably just at my desk at home. I don't really go out to coffee shops or anything like that. But I'm quite good at being flexible, and if I have to write on a train or wherever, then I can mostly.
And do you like to try and set aside a certain amount of time or number of words a day?
I don't really do a word count, but ideally I'd write for probably 3 hours a day. I think, well, that's if it's the first draft. I think any more than that is quite hard to maintain, and you just end up writing rubbish. So 3 hours a day of good quality writing time is great. When I'm at the editing stage, then I can probably edit all day. I love editing, and I feel like I really get into it. So yes, I could probably sit for 8 hours and edit, but that's different. Writing a first draft, I feel like you have to sort of be fresh, and then you get too tired after the 3 hour mark.
And what about a favourite writing snack or drink?
Drink wise, just water really, or tea. I always have tea in the morning, being British and all. Snacks, I don't. I mean, I try to stay away from them. I love crisps, but I couldn't. I would eat an entire enormous packet if you gave me one. So no, it would not be a good thing if I did that. So no snacks really.
Well, thanks so much for talking to me. Been great chatting to you. Do you want to let people know how they can keep in touch with you?
Sure. So I think you put the links on the Facebook group. I'm on Twitter at Calbish, and I'm on Facebook and Instagram at Caroline Bishop Author. So yes, you can contact me there. The book, the Lost Chapter came out in the UK in February, and I think it's also available in Australia and New Zealand right now, and it's out today in Canada, which is very exciting because I'm half Canadian, so I'm very excited to see it out in shops over there as well. But thanks so much for having me. It's been really nice to chat to you.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, and thanks for the people who asked questions.
Yeah, thanks to everyone for watching.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.